here we are with Evan George. And Evan, how do you like to be introduced?
Well, I suppose you could say that I'm somewhat fanatical about solution focus, and that's probably the best way to introduce me. That I was incredibly lucky back in the 1980s, very, very early days of solution focus, to meet up with two colleagues, Chris Iveson, Harvey Ratner, and all three of us really became somewhat passionate about this approach, experimenting, thinking about it, thinking about developing it, working with this approach. So yeah, a fanatic about solution focus, I'm afraid, is probably how I'd introduce myself.
Why is solution-focused brief therapy?
A number of things that are characteristics of this approach just fit my values, fit my beliefs. I guess that what solution focus did was to center on the client's capacity rather than the therapist's cleverness. And so many models of change have been focused on somehow the cleverness of the therapist in a way that almost devalued the client. And I always wanted to find a model that would center on the capacity of the client. Another thing I think that we became aware of very quickly was the potential that this approach has for brevity. Life is for living, not for talking about. So the less time that people can spend talking to me and the more time that they can spend getting on with their life, in all honesty, the better. But in addition to that, I think I was interested in a model that in some senses was simple, was actually simple and straightforward. And I like the simplicity and the straightforwardness of this approach.
Do you use solution-focused thinking in your own life?
Yes, I do. But I think that when you're using it in your own life, it's very hard to find the position of neutrality that solution focus works from. People have said, did you use it with your children? But actually using these questions with your own children is difficult, but you care too much in a very specific way. When I work with clients, I certainly care. I certainly want clients to get the very best outcomes they can get. But the nature of the outcome is up to them to define. I don't have a view on how they should be living their life. I don't have a view on what a good life would look like. Whereas I noticed that with my children, I did have a view. I really thought it was a good idea that my children should go to school, for example. I really thought it was a very, very good idea that, my children should do their homework, their assignments, stuff like that. And so I found it very hard to back off to the position of neutrality from where I could ask genuine not knowing questions. Because with my kids, I knew, of course, I listened to them as well, but my job was significantly to persuade them to do what I knew was right for them in that sense. Whereas in solution focus, if you start trying to persuade your client, you've lost it. It's a model that asks open questions, and whatever answer the client gives you is the right answer because it's their answer. Whereas, of course, with my children, they were wrong answers in that sense.
What are the three most important things people should master as they learn to use solution-focused talk?
I think the first thing that you have to find a way of doing, trust the client. When people tell us things in solution focus, you're not looking underneath their words to think, so what does this, and listen to the word really, what does this really mean? All right. Actually, what they said is what they meant. And you work with people's words. You work with what they give us. You work with what they say. And what that requires, I think, is a capacity to, whether you say trust, take seriously, listen to, Listen to your client. Another thing I think you need to learn to do is stay in people's descriptions. Just stay in their descriptions and work with their words. As the client responds, I'm listening for opportunities. I'm listening for opportunities to connect my next solution focused question to something they say. So all the time, I'm listening for a part of their answer upon which I can construct my next question. So it's a very, very particular way of listening. So again, both of those are connected. And again, something else that's connected. So in solution focus, in order to be able to ask these questions from a position of neutrality, although, trusting the client, all of that, we have to believe. And in order to believe, I think we have to consistently look for and listen for the things that tell us this person can change, you can change, all right? And so underpinning the belief is a very, very disciplined focus, looking for and listening for the things that tell us, yep, you can do this, you can do this. And of course, as you listen for and look for that stuff, inevitably you see it and hear it. And when you see it and hear it, because you see and hear what you look for and listen for. And as soon as that happens, what you begin to convey to the client all the time, because it's impossible not to, is to convey to the client, I believe in your capacity. And that's the message. That's the message, actually, at a very generic level. I want clients to take away from our sessions. This guy believed in my capacity to change. I think it's important.
Everyone brings their own previous experiences with them into what they do. Do you think family systems therapy influenced your use of solution-focused therapy, and how so?
Solution focus is, I think, I do see it as a systemic approach. I mean, Steve de Shazer, who was very much our mentor, Chris Harvey and my, I mean, his writings, he's very clear that he comes from a systemic background. I think if you take systemic really seriously, then the idea that you arrive at is that changing one part of the system actually is likely to be associated with change in another. So I don't need the whole system now. I don't need the whole family. If I'm working in relation to an adolescent and the adolescent won't come, then it might well be enough to work with the parents. If I can work with the parents and actually they can begin to change what they're doing in relation to the young person, then that might well actually make quite enough difference in relation to the young person without me ever seeing the young person. So I think that generally, that overall systemic framing, I think is important to me. And then I suppose I would pick out of the very broad systemic world some of the people who became really important to me over the years. And look, one of those groups, if you like, was the work of the Galveston Institute, Harold Gulishan and Harleen Anderson there, developing their not knowing approach. And I can look at their work and I can see an awful lot there that's interesting and useful from a solution-focused point of view. I can look at Carl Tom's work in Canada and look at his papers on questioning in the work that he was doing. And one of his papers was interventive interviewing. The idea that it's the interview rather than somehow some task or homework at the end of the session that makes the difference. It's the asking of the questions that makes a difference. And so Carl Tom's work, again, is still influential in my work. And I can look at Carl Tom and still be really interested in what he was up to, and the work of the Milan team generally, Boscolo and Checking and Prata and Palazzoli. Again, I can look at their work.
Do you think that influenced the brief tweaks on the American solution-focused approach? Like, say, the tomorrow question versus the miracle question, or your observations rather than compliments at the end. Like, you have slight tweaks that are very unique.
Yeah, we have. We worked with Steve de Shazer pretty well every year between 1990 and the year of his death, so 15 years. And Steve, what was interesting about him was that what he did in his therapy was never actually the same as what he wrote about in his work. So in
Really?
his work, no, absolutely not. There are clear differences. So in his work, he was very interested in Wittgenstein, in language games, in the idea of constructing realities through description and languaging. And so there was a centrality to the use of language, talking in his work, in his writings. But if you actually look at his therapy sessions right up to the end of his life, he was still interested in the idea of giving tasks, giving homework, and finding the right task, the right homework that would potentially make a difference in people's lives. So although his writings were all about constructing realities, his work was much more about encouraging people to do something different through the use of tasks and homework. So what Chris Harvey and I were interested in essence, was what if you took Steve's writings? What sort of model would you end up with? And at the heart of, I think, Steve's writings were ideas about simplicity and minimalism. What is the least that you can do with people that's associated nonetheless with a good outcome? So we began to look at all the things we did and began to think, look, what is not necessary? If you drop it, what doesn't make a difference to outcome? So we started dropping things that didn't really seem to make a difference to outcome. So in essence, look, we dropped the idea of tasks and homework in that sense. That didn't really seem to make much of a difference to outcome. We more or less dropped, certainly changed, but dropped the idea of compliments. And look, another thing I think that influenced us was the idea of centering the client in the work rather than centering the therapist's perception. That goes right back to what I was saying right at the beginning. The clever client, but centering the client in that sense. And what we noticed was at the ends of sessions, in our early use of solution focus, what we tended to do was, we'd be asking questions. Then suddenly at the end, we made our perception so central by giving feedback to the client on what we thought worked, if you like, compliments, you could call them. And we thought, look, what if you could change that? And so we moved away from that. Currently, what I do with people is to say to people towards the end of a session, look, of all the things you've heard yourself saying during the course of this time that we spent together, what do you think might be useful? What might be worth remembering? What might be worth taking back into your life with you? So centering the client's words rather than my words, in that sense, centering the client's thinking and perception rather than my thinking. But the other thing I think that influenced us was when we were thinking about centering the client, we got interested in this idea of invisibility. And so what we were interested in doing was making, if you like, the conversation more everyday and less unusual. And, the miracle question is a sort of a great big memorable question. Whereas if you just ask people, so what are your best hopes from our talking together today? How could you know? Some point down the track that our talking together ended up being useful to you. And then they say, well, I don't know, I want to be more confident. I want to like myself more. And, we could just say, look, if you were to be more confident and to like yourself more, how would you know? Or if you wanted to, you could drop in a little tomorrow question. If you woke up tomorrow feeling more confident and liking yourself more, how would you know? But what we were interested in doing was just making it low key. slightly invisible, almost slightly unmemorable at that level. So we've constantly been thinking about simplicity, about minimalism, about invisibility, about centering the client, but also straightening the line. What's the straightest line in therapy? And the straightest line seems to us to be, what are your best hopes? How will you know it's happening? What are you already doing that fits with that? What would be the next tiny signs of progress in that direction? And that seems an incredibly direct line from where people are to where they want to get to. The question I'm asking myself now, right now, actually, to what extent is a detailed picturing of the preferred future necessary? I wonder. We've spent a lot of time extending and detailing the picture of the preferred future. Is that necessary? Has there been any research actually looking at whether a detailed picture makes a difference? I don't know. So continuing to ask yourself questions all the time about your work and actually how to take your work forward, how to develop your work.
What fields beyond counseling do you feel best aligned with solution-focused thinking?
Obvious fit in consultation and supervision. I use these ideas virtually unchanged in consultation and supervision. But all of those, I think, what we've got the core of those, that we're talking with people, and there's a best hope from it. People coming to me at some level, whether I'm in their home or they come to see me or I'm online, whatever, but they come with an issue and we're talking together. I think the point that you start extending solution focus beyond that is where there isn't the same obvious and specific desired outcome that's determined by the. And I see many teachers using these ideas in a very interesting way, a very, very interesting, creative way. But if a child is behaving in a, let's say, challenging way in class, the teacher isn't going to go up in the middle of a class and say, so what are your best hopes from the rest of this class? You're just not going to do that. What you're doing is it shapes the way you're looking, it shapes the way you're paying attention, it shapes the way you're listening. You might start just paying attention to the times the child behaves a little more productively in class. You start watching out for that. You start noticing that, and you start asking yourself the question, whether you ask the child or not, what am I doing differently? You start watching out for, the times actually a session with that group works a little better. And you think, what did I do differently at those times? And how did the class respond differently? And then you might start asking yourself other questions, like, at times when I've got a bit stuck with a group in the past, what have I done that's worked? In a similar way, what have I done that's worked? What's been useful in those sorts of circumstances? So you can start asking, and you might ask yourself, and it'd probably be useful, probably not while you're with them, because, who knows, there may be chaos if you started thinking about this while you're with them. But you might start asking yourself, how would I know things were improving? What would be the first tiny signs that things are improving? So you can start watching out for them, because once you've specified them, you're more likely to notice them. And noticing them makes a difference. We could step away from teachers, for example, to leaders. Actually including in schools and including in international schools. And again, leaders are fairly unlikely to go around their schools asking everyone, what are your best hopes? However, it shapes your attention and it shapes the way you respond. It becomes, taking out of solution focus, a range of ways of focusing and paying attention. And that's much more generic. So if you're prepared to take the step out, away from a model that's focused on best hopes, then, of course, you have something that becomes hugely widely applicable in an enormously wide range of potential applications.
Were there ever any times when you felt solution-focused brief therapy wasn't working for you?
It's not a miracle cure. It doesn't get 100% good outcomes. Look, if what we're doing does not work, is not working, I think it's unethical to carry on doing something that's not working. And if we look at Mark Bierbach's research, Mark, clinical psychologist, academic clinical psychologist from Spain, wonderful guy. Mark says in Solution Focus that if after 3 sessions of Solution Focus you're seeing no change, the least good thing, that from the client's point of view, is for the same worker to carry on doing the same thing. Better than that is for the worker to change what you're doing and do something else. And actually equally good, if possibly not slightly better, is to change worker. What Mark points us to is the idea we should actually do something different, whatever it is. And there are lots of things you can do that are different. If you're working with, a child, you might think about inviting the teacher in, the key teacher, for example, into a session. Because as soon as the teacher's there, something different begins to happen in the conversation. Or to invite the parents in, for example. Or if you're working with a whole family, you might say, look, what about actually we meet separately? Now, there are other things, I think, where solution focus is not the appropriate approach to use. And we have to be very clear that solution focus is a model of therapy, and it's not a model for risk assessment. If you begin to get worried about someone's safety and what is necessary is safeguarding, then you need to step out of solution focus and bring a different range of questions that are associated with keeping people safe. Solution focus isn't about safety. Solution focus is about change. It's about change. So there's some jobs that it's not right for.
If you had to come up with an advertising campaign for Solution Focused Brief Therapy, what would your slogan be?
Solution focused, not wasting the client's time, and protecting the worker from burnout. That's what I'd need to build in. Something about having fun, because there's lots of smiling and lots of laughter in solution focus, even when you're addressing really, really tough stuff. So I'm beginning to see a slogan coming out of, brevity, fun, protecting from burnout, good for workers, good for clients. I mean, that would be the core of it. Solution focus, good for clients, good for workers.
You've done a lot of these, and you've also interviewed people. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there anything that you'd like to add?
One of the interesting things is, where is solution focus going? Where is it going? What's the future for this approach? That this approach is going to change in ways that I actually can't imagine. I can't imagine. We've taken the approach where we've taken it really over the last 25 to 30 years. And the really exciting thing would be to see the approach developing in a way that we couldn't imagine. Because we are who we are and we come from where we come. And, we've got a history. Steve de Shazer is with me every step of the way. I'm very influenced still by his thinking. But most people coming across the approach now, they'll never have met Steve. They may well never have read his writings. I think that would be a mistake, but anyway, they probably won't. And, they're going to start from a different place. And so if they're starting from a different place, they've got a potential different future. So for me, the exciting thing is where everyone, is going to take this approach. And I hope it's going to be in a direction I couldn't imagine, really.